Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yesterday was Ashura, an important event in the Islamic calendar. Every year on this day, millions of Muslims, particularly Shiite Muslims, commemorate Ashura, the Battle of Karbala, and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. The only event in the entire Islamic calendar which attracts as much attention and as big a crowd is the annual pilgrimage of Hajj. This perhaps illustrates the significance of Ashura in Islamic history. Today, inshallah, I will talk about Ashura as I promised. This is a very vast subject, and it is not possible to cover this event, Ashura, in any detail in one sermon. The main part of my sermon today will deal with Rumi's take on Ashura and Imam Hussein. It just so happens that I love both of them, both Imam Hussein and Rumi, and it can't get any better when I mix the two in one talk. There may be a few in the audience today who are not familiar with Ashura. So I will spend a few minutes to present a very brief history of Ashura, very briefly. I have had many talks on this subject in Farsi over the years. And if you are interested, those of you who speak and understand Farsi, you can visit my website. So let's begin. This is a very brief, short and sweet history of Islam. What led to the day of Ashura and the Battle of Karbala. Days after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, a bitter power struggle started in the relatively small community of the Prophet's followers in Arabia. At that time, Islam was pretty much confined to Arabia, and it had not spread to the Persian Empire, to the Roman Empire, Egypt, and beyond. So it was really at that point, right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam was confined to Arabia. So a bitter power struggle started when the Prophet died. The question of the day was, who should rule the Muslim community? There was no consensus among the Prophet's companions on this important question, on this issue. And that led to a deep division in the Muslim community. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, in order, ruled successively for a total of almost 50 years. These four were all companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and by and large, they were respected in the community. But this period was anything but normal. It was marred with political assassinations and civil wars. In fact, three of the four companions of the Prophet who ruled in the immediate aftermath of the Prophet's death, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, were all assassinated. And that can actually tell you how unstable the whole situation in the Muslim community was back then. After the assassination of Imam Ali, the power struggle intensified even more. That ultimately gave rise to a corrupt and despotic tyrant by the name Yazid, the second in the Umayyad dynasty, Khilafat Umayyad. Yazid was morally corrupt. He did not even practice the basic teachings of Islam. He was a gambler, a womanizer, and a heavy drinker. Now, just imagine a guy with these sort of qualities and a character is next in line to rule the Muslim community. To give legitimacy to his rule, Yazid demanded allegiance, or in Arabic, bay'at, of the respectable leaders in the Muslim community, including Imam Hussein. Hussein's allegiance was very critical and crucial for Yazid. Why? Because Hussein was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, the son of Imam Ali, the fourth caliph. And at that time, Hussein was the head of the Prophet Muhammad's household, Ahlul Bayt Payambar. Yazid was not a secular king. And here is the most important thing that we need to really pay attention to. Yazid was not a secular monarch. No, his official title was Amirul Mu'minin, or the commander of the faithful. A man, a gambler, a womanizer, a heavy drinker, was to be Amirul Mu'minin, commander of the faithful. In other words, he was in line to fill the shoes of the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Muslim community. Now, that was too much to bear for Hussein. Hussein's endorsement of Yazid, his bay'ah, his pledging of allegiance to Yazid, would have effectively meant that tyranny, oppression, injustice, and corruption was condoned by Islam. So Hussein refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid, no matter what the price for his refusal was. It didn't matter to Hussein what price he had to pay for not accepting Yazid's offer, not pledging allegiance to him. Shortly before he left Mecca to face Yazid, Imam Hussein delivered a very powerful sermon in Mecca to explain why he was rising up against Yazid. In that sermon, he said, and I quote, "I did not rise up for the cause of wickedness, amusement, corruption, or oppression, but I rose up to reform the nation of my grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad. I want to amr bi ma'ruf and nahy az munkar. I want to promote right and prevent wrong." So that was Imam Hussein's justification for rising up against the to-be Amirul Mu'minin Yazid. Now, amr bi ma'ruf and nahy az munkar, commanding right or enjoining right and forbidding evil, is an important commandment in the Holy Quran. It is a requirement of faith. It is not optional. In other words, it is the religious duty of a Muslim, according to the Holy Quran, to do amr bi ma'ruf and nahy az munkar. It is not optional. Inshallah, I will have a sermon on this subject in the future. Now, Imam Hussein left Mecca and headed east towards the seat of Yazid's power in Damascus, today's Syria. Imam Hussein was hoping to gain support for his uprising as he was taking the long journey from Mecca to Damascus. So at every small little town or small community he came across, he would do a sermon and try to attract support for his uprising from Muslims. Yazid sent his army to cut off Imam Hussein. He knew that Hussein was coming, so he sent his army to meet him and to cut him off. In the end, Hussein his family and a few dozen companions were forced to stop on the hot plains of a land called Karbala in present-day Iraq. Yazid's forces cut the supply of water for Imam Hussein's family and companions. A standoff emerged, and after 3 days of no food and water in the scorching heat, Yazid's forces attacked Imam Hussein's camp. Yazid's army numbered anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 troops. Some even say that they numbered 30,000 against less than 100 in Imam Hussein's camp. A very uneven battlefield. The battle of David and Goliath, if you want to picture it that way. On October 10, 680, Imam Hussein and most of his male companions were massacred in the battlefield. Yazid's forces did exactly what pagan Arabs used to do in the pre-Islamic times. They ran their horses over the bodies of the slain warriors. They burned down Imam Hussein's camp. They beheaded Imam Hussein and all of his fallen companions. And in the end, they took the women and children of Imam Hussein's extended family who had gone to Karbala with him as war captives. This atrocity shook the Muslim world, as you can imagine. The grandson of the prophet, the head of the prophet's household, was killed by the to-be Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he was beheaded. So this event shook the Muslim world. A series of uprisings followed the Battle of Karbala and ultimately led to the demise of the Umayyad dynasty. Imam Hussein is dear to all Muslims. So this was, again, a short history of Ashura, and hopefully those of you who were not familiar with Ashura now have a sort of a good perspective on what I'm going to say in the rest of the sermon. So Imam Hussein is dear to all Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis, and Sufis alike. Now, I don't have time to go into details, but over time, Shiites, that minority in the Muslim community, the Shiites over time latched on to Ashura as the main symbol of their identity. This is super critical, what I just told you. Ashura in time became the main symbol of the Shiite identity. Shiites created ceremonies to commemorate Ashura every year in what is known as Azadari in Farsi, or mourning and lamentation. Lamentation means a ceremony where people express their grief and sorrow over an event. Now, over time, Azadari, or mourning, ceremonial mourning, grew and grew more elaborate. Many elements were imported from outside of Islam. In fact, some of the elements of Azadari that you see today were imported from Christian communities of Southern Europe. I have spoken about that again in Farsi quite a bit. Today, in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, and elsewhere, we see huge ceremonies which mostly have a carnival atmosphere on the day of Ashura. People march in street processions, they weep, they slap their chests and chant. Some even covered their bodies with mud as a show of sorrow and grief. There is also flagellation, which means zanjirzani, flagellation, and where people beat their chests and backs with chain, which can often cause bleeding. Perhaps the most gruesome practice is called kamezani, where people cut themselves, particularly their heads or foreheads, with swords and knives, and then, as you can imagine, blood will flow. So these are part and parcels to these Ashura ceremonies that you see in full view all over the world. Again, let me repeat, these ceremonies evolved over time. At the beginning, in the first few years after the Battle of Karbala, Shiites, or those who loved Imam Hussein and the family and the Prophet's household, would gather and grieve over their loss. Now, in that, but a minority, which includes myself, commemorate Ashura differently, not through azadari, but differently. This minority observed Ashura, this occasion, to ponder and discuss what Imam Hussein did in order to learn from his experience. So the point is to celebrate Imam Hussein's rich character and legacy. And in a minute, I will tell you what I mean by celebration, okay? I've been accused of asking people to go on the street and celebrate like a Mardi Gras. No, that's not, you know, people like me says. Inshallah, this will become more clear to you, you know, what I mean by celebrating Imam Hussein's rich character and legacy. So in that vein, let me share with you some of Rumi's teachings about Ashura and Imam Hussein. I know this may be a bit of a shock to some of you, Rumi being perhaps the height of Islamic spiritual tradition, Islamic mysticism. How can a Sufi like him have an interest in Ashura? Because we always think of Ashura in terms of azadari and what you know, the folks do on the street these days. Now, Rumi loves Imam Hussein. He loves Imam Hussein primarily because Hussein symbolized love. Hussein symbolized love. And Karbala was an arena where love was in full display. That's where love was in full display in Karbala. Again, it's counterintuitive. This is not how a typical Shiite actually views the Battle of Karbala. So that's the Hussein's main attraction for Rumi. Imam Hussein symbolized love for Rumi. In book 6 of Masnavi, Rumi tells a fictional story. Again, this story is fictional. He made it up. The setting for this story is the city of Aleppo in today's Syria. Rumi starts the story with a blunt critique of azadari, or the ceremonial mourning. And then after he delivers his critique in this story, he tells us what Imam Hussein actually meant to him. This is how the story begins. Rumi says, on the day of Ashura, a traveler reached the Antioch gate in Aleppo. Large crowds of men and women had gathered to mourn the suffering of Imam Hussein and his family at the hands of Yazid. They wept, they cried so loudly, such that their weeping and loud cries of grief filled the whole city and the desert outside. The traveling man happened to be a poet. He was very impressed with the large size of the crowd and how passionately they were mourning. But, and here is the catch, he did not know whom they were mourning for. He said to himself, the deceased person must have been a really good man, very popular, that people are pouring their hearts out for him. So he approached the crowd to inquire about the deceased. نام او و القاب او شرحم دهید که قریبم من شما اهل دهید. چیست نام و پیشه و اوصاف او تا بگویم مرثیه زلطاف او. مرثیه سازم که مرد شاعرم تا از اینجا برگ و لالنگی برم. The man asked the people, inform me of his name and title, for I am a stranger and you are the townspeople. What is his name and profession and character? Tell me, so I may compose an elegy on his gracious qualities. Elegy means mournful poem. Tell me, so I may compose an elegy on his gracious qualities. I will make an elegy, for I am a poet, and in doing so, I may reap a reward from here. As you can imagine, the people in the crowd, in the mourning crowd, in the Azadari, they were stunned with this man's ignorance about Ashura. How could you not know anything about Imam Hussein and Ashura? So one of the mourners said to the traveling man, آن یکی گفتش که هی دیوانه ای، تو نی شیعه عدو خانه ای، روز عاشورا نمیدانی که هست، ماتم جانی که از قرنی به است. پیش مؤمن کی بود این قصه خوار، قدر عشق گوش عشق گوشوار. پیش مؤمن ماتم آن پاک روح، شهره تر باشد ز صد طوفان نوح. The Shiite said to the traveling man, are you mad? You are not a Shiite. You are an enemy of the Prophet's household. Don't you know that the day of Ashura is a day of mourning for a single soul that is more excellent than the whole world? How could this tragedy be taken lightly by the true believer? Love for the earring is in proportion to love for the ear. In the true believer's view, the mourning for that pure spirit, for Hussein, is more celebrated than 100 floods of Noah. In other words, Rumi says that, according to that Shiite, that the story of Ashura and Hussein is more famous than the story of Noah and the flood of Noah. Now Rumi uses sarcasm. He uses sarcasm to make a crucial point. The traveler responds to that Shiite man who had accused him of being a disbeliever. The traveling man said, گفت آری لیک کی کو دور یزید. گفت آری لیک کو دور یزید. کی بودست این غم چه دیر اینجا رسید. چشم کوران آن خسارت را بدید. گوش کران این حکایت را شنید. خفته بودستید تا اکنون شما که کنون جام دریدیت از عزا. The traveler said, yes, but when was the reign and time of Yazid? When did this grievous tragedy occur? How late has the news of Ashura arrived here? The eyes of the blind have seen that loss. The ears of the deaf have heard that story. Have you been asleep until now, that only now you have rent your garments in mourning? I know it's a little bit funny, but Rumi is trying to make a very important point. Mourning for a loved one makes perfect sense in the days and weeks following the loss. But perpetual mourning every year over an event that took place centuries ago, does it make sense? Now Rumi shares with us his appreciation of Ashura and Imam Hussein through the traveler's mouth. Again, from this point forward, it's Rumi that actually is putting his own words in the mouth of that traveling poet. پس عزا بر خود کنید ای خفتگان، زان که بد مرگی است این خواب گران. روح سلطانی ز زندانی بجست، جامه چه درانیم و چون خاییم دست. چون که ایشان خسرو دین بوده اند، وقت شادی شد چو بسکستند بند. سوی شادروان دولت تاختند، کنده و زنجیر را انداختند. روز ملک است و جشن و شاهنشهی، گر تو یک ذره از ایشان آگهی. Then, O sleepers, mourn for yourselves. Mourn for yourselves, for this heavy slumber is an evil death. A royal spirit has escaped from a prison. Why should we rend our garments, and why should we bite our hands in sorrow? Since they, Hussein and his companions, were kings of the true religion, it was the hour of joy for them when they broke their bonds. They sped towards the pavilion of empire. They cast off their shackles and chains. This is the day of their kingship and pride and honor, if you have an iota of knowledge of them. So Rumi comes down really hard on Ashura mourners. He says, mourn for yourselves, not Hussein, because you are in deep sleep. Somebody should slap you and wake you up. You are completely ignorant of whom Hussein truly was. Hussein was the king of the true Islam. He and his companions did not bow to a tyrant because they wanted to remain true to their pledge to God, that they would only and only bow to him and the truth. That's what happened in Karbala. Hussein, in not pledging his allegiance to Yazid, he proved that he would only surrender to God and the truth. Is this a cause for grief and mourning? It was Hussein who said, death with dignity is better than a life of humiliation. Brothers and sisters, this is a saying of Imam Hussein, and I encourage you to write it down and put it on the wall of your house. Look at it every day. Imam Hussein said, death with dignity is better than a life of humiliation. Ashura was a day of joy for this man. Why? Because he lived and died with dignity. He lived and died with dignity. Should we mourn such a divine spirit? Rumi continues his blasting of ignorant mourners. ورنه ای آگه برو بر خود گری زان که در انکار نقل و محشری بر دل و دین خرابت نوحه کن که نمی بیند جز این خاک کهن. And if you don't have true knowledge of Hussein and Ashura, go weep for yourself, for you are disbelieving in the removal from this world to the next and in the assembly at the judgment day. Mourn for your corrupt heart and religion. Mourn for your corrupt heart and religion, for your heart does not see except this lowly earthly life. Wow, this, brothers and sisters, is heavy. Mourn for your corrupt heart and religion. Weep for yourselves. That's what Rumi says. Look at yourselves. Your hearts are filled with love for earthly possessions, not love of God. You are so attached to this world as if there is no life after this life. This is a sure sign of disbelief. Mourn your corrupt religion. Whatever religion you have, it ain't sure Islam. It ain't sure Islam. You don't bear the marks of Hussein. What are the marks of Hussein? Now, here is the last verse from that story that I want to share with you, where Rumi finally tells us what the marks of Imam Hussein and his true followers are. These are the marks of those who claim to be lovers and followers of Hussein. ور همی بیند چرا نبود دلیر پشتدار و جان سپار و چشم سیر. والله یک دنیا معنی تو این یک بیت شعر هست. این رو باید آخوندها به نام فرهنگ حسین، به نام قیام حسین، به نام شیعیان بدن. ور همی بیند چرا نبود دلیر پشتدار و جان سپار و چشم سیر. If you actually see the world beyond this world, why aren't you courageous, trusting of God, self-sacrificing, and fully contented? Rumi here spells out 4 attributes of Imam Hussein's character. These are also the attributes of Imam Hussein's true followers. Let me briefly tell you what those attributes are. The first one, daliri, courage and bravery. Imam Hussein did not run away from fighting against a tyrant, even in the face of sure death. Why? Why didn't he run away? Because of the second attribute of his character, according to Rumi, poshdari. Poshdari is a very beautiful Farsi word, which means tawakkul in the Arabic language, or full trust in God. Imam Hussein had full trust in God. On the day of Ashura, in the battlefield against the army of Yazid, Imam Hussein put his trust in God to achieve victory. And God delivered. And God delivered. Yes, Hussein lost the battle, but he accomplished his mission. What was his mission? To completely discredit Yazid, to expose Yazid and tell the world that Islam does not sanction tyranny, Islam does not sanction oppression, Islam does not sanction injustice and corruption. The third attribute that Rumi shares here of Imam Hussein, Jan Separi, self-sacrifice. Imam Hussein was willing and ready to lose it all, to remain, in order to remain true to his faith, to submit only and only to God. Brothers and sisters, if you want to know what you say every day in your daily prayers, Iyyaka na'bud. Do you know what that means? When you say, "Oh Lord, we surrender only to you." Do you want to know what that means? Look at what Imam Hussein did in Karbala. With his blood, not tongue, with his blood, Hussein taught us what Iyyaka na'bud truly means. Hussein refused to bow to a corrupt tyrant that demanded his allegiance. When somebody is willing to put all he's got on the line, what do we call that? What do we call that? Love. Yes, love. Only lovers are willing and ready to lose it all for their beloved. And that's primarily why Rumi admires Imam Hussein so much, because Imam Hussein was a true lover. He put all he had on the line so that he would only bow to his beloved God. The fourth characteristic and attribute of Imam Hussein's character, Chashm Siri. Chashm Siri. What an incredibly meaningful Farsi word with unfortunately no good translation in English. Chashm Siri. What an amazing word. Chashm Sir. کسی که چشم و دلش سیر هست. Loosely, we can render Chashm Siri as full contentment. I can just go on and literally spend a couple of hours talking about this feature of Imam Hussein, Chashm Siri. In a nutshell, Imam Hussein was not hungry for financial wealth, for power, fame, social status, and that's why he turned down Yazid's bargain. Yazid offered a deal to Hussein. Recognize me and as Amirul Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, and then you can have anything your heart desires. And Imam Hussein declined. Why? Because his soul was fed from another source, from God. Hussein's soul was fed by the divine. And when God fills your heart and soul, you will not be hungry for anything else. This is the end of my first khutbah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So what is the message of Ashura and the Battle of Karbala? In this story, Rumi argues that Ashura and Karbala had other faces. Faces that most Shi'is fail to see. What do mourners of Imam Hussein see in Karbala these days? They see burnt down camps, severed heads, a desert filled with blood, a desert covered in the blood of the most beautiful persons, such as Imam Hussein. They see women and children in captivity. This is not beautiful, is it? And because they see such an ugly sight, their hearts get filled with hatred for Yazid, and their eyes become tearful. And that's a natural reaction. But Rumi sees another face of Ashura and Karbala, a face that is beautiful and uplifting. What is that face? In Karbala, Rumi sees Imam Hussein's overwhelming love for God. Rumi sees the warriors' commitment to God, their loyalty to Imam Hussein. Rumi sees perseverance in the face of unbelievable hardships. He sees self-sacrifice of the warriors. And I tell you, there is absolutely no sight more beautiful in the world than the sight of love, commitment, loyalty, sacrifice, perseverance, courage, and bravery, all present in one small area in one short day, in Karbala on the day of Ashura. This is a rarity. This is rare. That is why Imam Hussein is so special to Muslims of different stripes. When Rumi sees this sight, his heart gets filled with joy, not hatred. Joy in the knowledge that such people like the warriors of Karbala, walked on this earth. This gives hope to humanity, that human beings have the potential for such admirable qualities. It is said that after the Battle of Karbala, Yazid's victorious army took the severed heads of Imam Hussein and his fallen companions, along with the captive women and children, to Yazid's palace in Damascus. One of Yazid's generals by the name Ibn Ziyad turned to Lady Zainab, Imam Hussein's brave sister, and said, كيف رأيت صنع الله بأخيك بأهل بيتك? Zainab, did you see how God Almighty, dealt with your brother and your family in Karbala? And then Lady Zainab responded, absolutely amazing. ما رأيت إلا جميلا. ما رأيت إلا جميلا. I only saw sheer beauty in Karbala. All I saw in Karbala was sheer beauty. Lady Zainab saw firsthand in Karbala what Rumi shared with us. She saw overflowing love, sacrifice, loyalty, commitment, perseverance, courage, and bravery. If these qualities do not qualify for sheer beauty, I don't know what does. Rumi invites us to view Ashura and Karbala through the lens of Imam Hussein, not through the lens of Yazid and his army. When we zoom in on Yazid's accomplishments, we will see those horrific scenes that I mentioned in my sermon. But instead, if we zoom in on Imam Hussein's performance, then we will see sheer beauty. This view is far more positive, far more inspiring and empowering than what we see in Azadari. Imam Hussein and his companions will live forever in the collective memory of Muslims. We can learn so many constructive lessons from them, lessons that would enable us to be better Muslims and better human beings. Loving, more giving, contented, courageous, and brave. I hope that you are inspired by Imam Hussein as much as I am inspired. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.